My Lords, this huge group was always going to be a pivotal one for us to discuss, and for me it's just full of moral dilemmas. On many of the amendments I'm genuinely torn. I don't know where I stand on some of them, and therefore I appreciate the debates that we've had so far, and I think it's been very worthwhile to hear the different sides of the argument. When the noble Lord Mendelssohn spoke earlier, he kind of stirred me up. But every time I say stirred up, I think of stirring up hatred, so it wasn't that. But I mean, his contribution was very important because he emphasised that a lot is at stake, and I think a lot is at stake. I said on the first day of committee that I knew that simply reiterating the formal importance of the right to protest was just not sufficient in the period that we're living in, because we're facing new types of protests. We're facing some pretty vicious and abusive gatherings calling themselves protests, and that leaves somebody like me in a difficult dilemma. I'm a free speaker, but then I have witnessed the visceral rise of Jew hatred in public and on our streets, and so I'm torn. I have a lot of sympathy with the intentions of the noble Lords Walney, Pollock, Lee of Hurley, Lord Pannick, Baroness Foster, just to name some of them, and I understand where they're coming from. But as the noble Lord Mendelssohn himself admitted, there are a lot of existing powers that aren't used. And that strikes me as the problem. And my fear is that we have a policing crisis, powers not used for cultural or deeper political reasons, and that what we do is we try and compensate by making more laws. And I think that actually that is not going to be able to solve the problem of the cultural normalisation of anti-Semitism. If anything, those new laws that could also not be enforced could be a distraction. So despite my reservations, my fear is that the deeper problem can lead to bad lawmaking and abandoning key principles that I think stand up for Western civilisation, democracy and so on, because we're so desperate to do something. Laws driven by reaction, by the way, to specific issues can go very wrong. I've noticed that in Australia, in the wake of the Bondi Beach massacre and all that happened, what law have they come up with? Islamophobia is a hate crime where you can get 5 years in prison. So sometimes lawmaking isn't the right answer. This is, on the other hand, a huge and disparate group. And so I want to tentatively support and ask some questions on this. I tentatively support the amendments in the name of the noble Lady Baroness Blower and the noble Lord Hayne in their attempt at specificity in tightening up the wording of Clause 24 and the restriction on protests at places of worship. And that just seems sensible because so much of this bill suffers from far too broad a language. So keep leaving out in the vicinity and inserting within 50 metres of the outer perimeter or deciding on a specific space seems sensible to me. I was worried also about the vagueness and the elasticity of the phrase may intimidate, and did prefer the purpose of intimidating individuals accessing a place of worship, because I don't like that notion of a lack of intention in the law. It worries me. However, I'm aware that context is important here. At a synagogue, even if the protest isn't intended to intimidate, it's pretty clear that it will be intimidating if you've got people walking past a synagogue shouting baby killers, genocide apologists, blood on your hands, etc., aimed at Zionists. Well, I don't know who you think goes to a synagogue, but let me assure you, a few of them are likely to be Zionists, right? And so, as a consequence, it will be intimidating. And so, I'm not sure about that one at all. But of course, as with much of this bill, the police already have existing powers that would allow them to impose conditions on demonstrations that intimidate or harass people who wish to engage in worship under the Public Order Act. Those powers are rarely used or enforced, and that drives me mad. The police stand by and look on far too often, which is why Baroness Jones of Mulscombe Stand Part 24 does appeal to me. Also, I'm not convinced that a ban on demos in the vicinity of all places of worship in primary legislation is the right way to go. I can imagine a situation not necessarily while people are worshipping, fair enough, but I can imagine a situation in which, for example, on something like child abuse, there would be a demonstration or a protest of some sort outside a Catholic church. I can imagine a situation outside of a Church of England establishment that there might be a protest about the closure of local parish churches or the paying of reparations, which, by the way, I think is mad. But anyway, I also think that there are times when you can imagine a situation in which a protest outside a mosque would be perfectly legitimate if, for example, you had an Islamist hate preacher inside, or you had young men tooling up outside, and there might be a counter-protest. So, in other words, I just don't want to have a ban on anywhere religion having any kind of protest, because although I believe in freedom of religion very strongly, I don't want any blasphemy-style laws being introduced either. I wanted to raise a problem, or ask a question really, about 370AA, which is the offence of incitement of holy or religious war or intifada. I at least appreciate that this amendment is specific. I mean, we know where we're going with it. Ban those slogans, right? But as a free speech, it always makes me feel a bit anxious. But of course, it then opens the door potentially to that situation where the government are going to gather together slogans that they're going to ban, and that makes me rather nervous. But at least I can see the point of that. I'm particularly concerned, by the way, about Amendment 378A, protecting democratic buildings, parliamentary offices, constituency offices and surgeries, because I actually think that these democratic buildings are for the demos. There is a real danger of kind of wrapping democratic buildings in cotton wool, or putting up gates, as we have done here, which is the public are the enemy, we can't see through. I really don't like that, and I do think that that's rather dangerous. I feel very squeamish about the Noble Lord Hanson's Amendment 381, which is about the harassment of representatives in their own homes. Not because I want anyone to harass representatives in their own homes, but I do think if there's harassment going on, people should be arrested. But I'm worried about special protection for politicians. I mean, why not other well-known public figures or celebrities or anything else? In other words, I'm worried about carving out the public square, where you say no protest here, and say to the public you're not allowed in the public square. And I think that that's very dangerous. Like the Noble Lord Strasbourg, one of the biggest threats to protest rights is undoubtedly the government's Amendment 372. Can I ask the Noble Lord Hanson of Flint, unless there's clarity, is this about geography, as other people have asked? Because the notion that an area can't have regular protests does seem peculiar to me. It's not where a particular geographic street with synagogues in it, by the way, but this whole area around Westminster, there's regularly demonstrations here, as there would be, as there should be, as a vibrant democracy would have it. And I don't want those to fall under this problem, and so on and so forth. Right, what else do I want to say? Right, final thing, I think. The designation of extreme criminal protest groups, which is the Noble Lord Walney explained, to a pre-terrorist threshold. I really appreciate a sensitive attempt to deal with the problem of the Palestine Action debacle, which has been a debacle, by prescribing them and then turning them into free speech martyrs, which is ludicrous, the people who support them. And I do think there is something to be done. I also absolutely support the amendment which says no public funding for certain groups who are obviously, Islamist extremist groups, and so on and so forth. It seems sensible, but I think those amendments are very specific, very targeted, and allow us something to really think about before report stages. A lot, though, is we have problems in society, we want to solve them, and we bring in sweeping laws that are going to be anti-democratic and dangerous for everyone, rather than facing up to and confronting the real problems we've got, which are often not legal but cultural, political, and based on cowardice and not being dealt with by politicians, but they can't always be dealt with via the law.
My Lords.